Very briefly, by way of introduction, many of you are students of the two or have been students of the two faculty members here. Professor Jim Toronto was once one of the directors of this very center, is now in the Department of Arabic Languages, has a PhD from Harvard University, and is the author of many works, and has also spent a lot of time in Italy, and will be talking today on the challenge of integrating Muslims in Italy. And the subtitle is The Challenge of Talking About My Talk Without Having the Slides That I've Prepared for My Talk, right? So he's going to be dealing with Italy. And then after that, Professor John Matthews, who is a recent hire from the University of Washington in the French department, will be talking, his remarks are called Kicking the Anthill, the Securitization of French Islam. Let me turn 15 minutes over first to Professor Toronto, and then Professor Matthews. Should leave us a good 10-15 minutes for your questions and comments afterwards.
Thank you. A pleasure to be with you today. You have to trust me that there really are some terrific slides about Islam's integration into the social geography of Italy, but you'll have to imagine them as I speak, I suppose. My paper tries to explore the internal and external challenges to integration of Muslims in Italy's public sphere, and also the prospects that this might take place. I'm really interested in how modern pluralistic societies and new religious minorities encounter and adapt to each other as kind of a broader theme of what I'm trying to do. I'm optimistic that despite some formidable obstacles to Islam's integration, a number of historical, political, and social factors provide promise of a gradual but ultimately successful inclusion of Muslims in Italy's religious landscape. Just some numbers to begin with about the context of Italian Islam. Most estimates range from about 800,000 to 1 million Muslims in Italy. A far smaller percentage, which is 2% of the total Italian population, than other European countries, mostly because the massive influxes of immigration began in Italy relatively late, so only about the last 15 or 20 years. About 40,000 of that number are Muslims who immigrated and then became naturalized citizens, and there are about 10,000 Italians who have converted to Islam. Most of the Muslims in Italy are not associated with the official Islam of the mosques. And this runs contrary to some of the stereotypes that people have, that it's a very monolithic group of people, all of whom look back to their countries and to maybe radical groups for funding. In fact, in Italy, it's a very diverse group spread across the country and not able to organize themselves and present a united front. And many of them don't want to as well. Internal issues facing the Islamic community. I've noted in my interviews, in my observation, in my reading, 4 general views among Italian Muslims of how to construct an Italian Islamic identity and how to deal with the surrounding political and social realities. One I call isolation. There is a large number of Muslims who simply don't want to have anything to do with the surrounding culture. They try to transplant their identity, their way of life from Cairo or Casablanca or Dhaka or someplace else to the Italian context. It's a very exclusivist point of view. I visited the Viale Jenner Mosque in Milano, which has been accused of being a hotbed of radicalism, and I thought I was back in Cairo, Egypt. For blocks around, you could only hear Egyptian Arabic being spoken. The Imam Abu Imad that I spoke with spoke Arabic. We spoke Arabic the whole time. He'd been in Italy for 10 years, but still couldn't really speak Italian and didn't know what the issues were when I tried to ask about politically related kinds of issues. They were serving Egyptian food. There was Quran playing. It was this kind of ghettoization of Islam that you see happening with the isolationist attitude. Another attitude is assimilation. There are a good many Muslims who just want to shed their identity as Muslims and become a part, seamlessly blend into the Italian landscape so that they can avoid the prejudice, harassment, and bigotry that often accompanies being an immigrant. A kind of cultural camouflage is adopted in order to avoid those problems. Another point of view is what I call external participation. I would say this is probably the largest group because it represents the first generation of Muslim immigrants in Italy. They have one foot in Italy, but the other foot's still back in their country of origin. Their body may be in Italy, but in a way their head and their heart are in their homeland. And so they want to get involved in Italian life, but only to a certain extent, in kind of a superficial way, to achieve economic and political benefits. Finally, there is a group, a very small group, I would say at this point, comprised mostly of Italian Muslims, that is, converts to Islam, to Muslim intellectuals, and especially to the second generation, the younger generation, who want to fully and vigorously be involved in Italian life, and Italian civil society, who see themselves completely as Italian but also as Muslim with no contradiction, and are willing to take risks in terms of reinterpreting traditional views of Islam and of the Sharia. Oftentimes this group is seen by the external integrationists, let's say the participants, as being ones who are too liberal and watering down Islam to accommodate Western requirements. I also mentioned that there's this complexity and geographical diffusion of the Italian Islamic community that makes it difficult for Muslims to act in concert to achieve common goals. They have tried several times to achieve an agreement with the Italian government, which is required to have certain privileges for religions in Italy. But they haven't been able to find this united front that Dr. Jacobi talked about. The Italian government wants one group, one person to speak for the whole Italian community, Italian Muslim community. But there are at least 3 or 4 groups. One group is represented by the big mosque in Rome that's funded by ambassadors and embassies from various Islamic countries. They consider themselves the true Muslim representatives because their mosque is in Rome and they're right there near the Vatican and near the Italian political center. However, another group represented by a mosque in Milan called UCOI, it's an acronym that stands for the Union of Organizations, Islamic organizations in Italy, basically. Kind of first-generation immigrants who live in Italy. They consider this other group to be imposters because they don't live and work in Italy. They don't know the realities of life. So they have this organization of about 200 Islamic centers around the country, and they wave the flag as being the legitimate representative. On the other hand, there's a group called CORES, the Comunità Religiosa Italiana, which is exclusively Italians who have converted to Islam. They have their headquarters also in Milan. They dismiss the other 2 groups because these other groups are immigrants. They speak with an accent. They don't know Italian life. They can't get on television and talk about Italian sports and really relate to the Italians' culture and find their way through the Italian political system. So Correa says we're the only legitimate group. And there's a lot of rivalry and clashes of ethnicity and even interpretation of what Islam is. So there's that problem. Externally, there are some issues that Muslims face in terms of achieving an accord, or intesa as it's called, that the Italian government requires of all religions. Even though in theory there's religious freedom in Italy and this should be open to all, it's a very highly politicized process for achieving the intesa. Therefore, groups like the Muslims and the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses and a number of others haven't been able to achieve that highest level of recognition. Now, even without that recognition, there are a lot of things that religions can do. I mean, you can still meet, you can rent and own property, you can propagate your faith, you can wear the hijab or the head covering and other religious symbols. So it's still a fairly liberal environment in Italy. In fact, quite liberal compared to a lot of other European countries. But there are some practical matters that are important in terms of having this intesa. For instance, the Muslims want the intesa because they want to be able to have chaplains go into hospitals and prisons, their own chaplains. They want to conduct funerals and marriages and have them be recognized by the state. They want certain designated burial places in the cemeteries. They want to have the right to observe religious holidays and to have time off at work for their 5 prayer times, which is a big problem if your Sabbath day, so to speak, is on a different day. Also, there's a tax benefit that comes throughout Italy to churches and cultural organizations that a church can have if they've been recognized by the state. There are, however, some important obstacles to the ability of the Muslims to achieve this intesa or accord. First of all is the influence of historical attitudes in Italy. Going back at least 1,000 years, there are the image in the Italian psyche of the Saracen who raided along the Italian coast as far north as the Alps in Torino. And so there's this idea that Muslims are violent and we have this history of confrontation. Of course, after 9/11, these images were only reinforced. So there are strong feelings of Islamophobia among Italians. The impact of the media on public opinion is also another source that works against Muslim integration. There have been some highly visible, well-read books, articles in newspapers. Oriana Fallaci's work about Islam, she's famous as a journalist in Italy. She wrote some very virulent and I would say skewed work about Islam in Italy that some think has had a wide impact. Another strong force is opposition by the far right in Italian politics. We see in most European countries these kind of xenophobic, ultranationalist groups who prey on the public fears about immigration groups coming in and kind of imposing certain values that are against what is often called the European Christian identity. And there's this us versus them kind of an attitude. In Italy, La Lega Nord, the Northern League, which is primarily, as the name suggests, found in the north, especially in the northeast, Il Nord Profondo, as the Italians like to call it, the deep north. Very well organized, highly financed. They've published a lot of literature, and they have billboards up around Italy, and there are spots even on TV. They've managed to win some cabinet posts in the center-right coalition of the current government, and so they have a lot of influence in working against the integration of Muslims, but not only Muslims, other groups as well. Finally, the position of the Catholic Church is quite ambivalent, actually. On the one hand, you have Vatican II, which, when you read the documents from that and talk to current officials of the Vatican, which I did while I was in Rome a few weeks ago, it's very much an interfaith cooperation kind of an outreach. We believe that we as churches can work together to bring about common causes that will lift and benefit humanity. That's the general tone. But when you go into the streets and talk to the parish priests and listen to what some of the cardinals and bishops of the Italian church, that is the local church, are saying and doing, it's oftentimes absolutely contradictory to that tone. In fact, it's very much like the Northern League, the far-right politicians, in denouncing immigration, don't marry immigrants. This immigration presents a grave threat to our identity and to our way of life. So you have these two competing positions, and it's very real and very confusing too if you're trying to figure out what the impact of the Catholic Church is. Finally, I want to say something about the prospects for eventual recognition and integration. As I said, I'm quite optimistic that over time, integration of Islam in Italy's spiritual geography will take place. And here are some factors that I think work in favor of that. There's a growing sophistication of Muslims in understanding and making effective use of the institutions of Italian civil society, the media, the courts, the educational system. Remember that these Muslims in Italy are still primarily first generation. They've come from societies where they're not used to liberal societies' democratic processes. And so they're fairly unsophisticated, but learning, let's say. So, for instance, there's an Islamic Anti-Defamation League that's been formed to challenge the La Lega Nord, the far-right politicians, and movement. In court, I actually went to the courthouse in Bologna one day to talk to the attorneys on both sides on an issue where they had put up billboards defaming Islam, and now the Muslims had attorneys who were going to confront them in court about this. There's a lot of outreach in schools and community centers. They're forming women's associations to go out and talk about the positive aspects of Islam and try to dispel myths. A lot of interfaith kinds of activities. I have a group of Italian friends, scholars from the Catholic University of Milan coming here in a month or two who are involved in teaching Arabic after school to not only Arab immigrant children but also Jews and Christians, because they want to encourage immigrant parents not to set up their own schools to do this, because that only separates them. So this is an opportunity to integrate them into society. There's campaigns of various kinds to provide accurate information in the media, internet sites, radio, TV, lots of letters and articles now being written by Muslims to challenge things that are said in the media. They don't take it sitting down, in other words. They're becoming more activist in that regard. I believe that with increasing involvement of Muslims in government, in sports, in the military, in the media, over time the image of Islam will improve and change public opinion, and that will lead to the kind of acceptance that is necessary. I believe that the second and third generation, I Giovani Musulmani, is actually the name of an organization that's been founded to put distance between them and the first generation, who are seen as more hardline, the external participants. The young Muslims of Italy are anxious to integrate and to say that we can adapt and still be true to our identity. I think that there's great hope. They've been very active in interfaith activities with Jews, Christians, Muslims. At the death of the Pope recently, they had a bus that was filled with students from different religions, and they drove through Rome as a sign of solidarity for the Catholic Church in a time of mourning. It's expected that in the upcoming elections in April that the government will shift from center-right to center-left, and if that happens, it's believed that there will be some changes made that will positively impact religious minorities, issues about citizenship, how long it takes, issues about who can have an intesa with the government. Why is the process so difficult anyway? Why is it that some groups get it and some don't? Those are issues that are being debated. I also want to make this point. As a historian of religion, I'm really interested in the process, and it's a long process, by which new groups are inserted into a society. There's this process of confrontation, of even hostility. But over time, there's an accommodation and an inclusion. But it takes time. Think of our own example as Latter-day Saints. 150 years ago today, and I would love to have shown you some slides depicting Latter-day Saints and immigrants going to Utah. They all portray this sense of a threat, of Mormons are fanatics, that they practice polygamy. It has signs about Mountain Meadows Massacre. Radicalism often comes to mind. We were the Muslims of that era, so to speak. We were the ones who were marginalized and looked at as the grave threat to American identity and way of life. But compare that to where we are today. What changes have taken place? Well, those changes have come internally in our church. The policy on the blacks in the priesthood, for instance, and the changes in polygamy made it more possible for us to become part of mainstream American society. On the other hand, there have been changes in perception out there in society and maybe a liberalization of laws as well. I think that same process is at work in Europe and certainly in Italy. A lot of this will just take time. But I think those changes in perception will take place. My time is up, but I am optimistic that this will happen as Italians can continue to ask themselves hard questions about what does it mean to be an Italian, where are we going, what do we want to be as a nation. These are new questions that Italians, a very homogeneous society, have had to ask more recently. And of course the Italian Muslims themselves have to come to grips with a number of issues about their identity and what we can compromise in our interpretation of religion without giving up our identity. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Kennedy Center for this chance to come back and speak again on a subject of great personal interest. To begin with, I'd like to start with my main points, my two main points. And the first one, and again, I'm taking this from the perspective of the French state, where Professor Toronto spoke about what was happening on the ground. I think this is a nice sort of a very complimentary sort of a discourse. But for the French state, Islam is not special. And I want to suggest that Islam is not special because it does not enjoy persecution exclusive to itself as Islam, but really this falls this becomes part and parcel of a very long history of religious persecution of many kinds, beginning with the Catholic Church, Protestants, Jews, and now today in Islam. And so really it's difficult for me to hear that the Islamic or the Muslim population is being singled out, especially when this really fits into a very long history of a particular French attitude toward organized religion in France. The second one is that the French state is very active in trying to identify and discern and create what it considers a good and a bad variant of Islam, one which is supported by the state and one which is actively persecuted by it. And the kinds of things, the mechanisms and the organizations and the people that are put in place to combat this so-called bad variant is what I want to talk about today with the secularization of French Islam. And so to begin with, we'd mentioned that France enjoyed a sort of outlier status with respect to Islams in Europe, along with Turkey, for example. It was no coincidence, for example, that President Jacques Chirac, when he made his first official pronouncement on the headscarf ban 2 years ago in French schools, he did this in Tunisia, a former French colony, which along with Turkey and France itself actively discourages, in fact prohibits, headscarves and other such wear on young Muslim women in public schools. And so France is characterized by a number of superlatives which make it a very interesting and unique case. First of all is the laïcité, the separation of church and state, which began as an expressly anti-clerical, anti-Catholic separation. It's right now the most militant the most militant separation of church and state in Europe. And this has colored many of the aspects and many of the discourses we've had on the kinds of discussions as to what is permissible within the public sphere. The second one is the largest Muslim population in Europe, with estimates ranging from 3 to 8 million. Again, it's impossible to say because the French government forbids minorities. The French government forbids an appartenance or belonging of any kind other than that of basic citizenship. And so asking questions about one's background, for example, is expressly forbidden. One has no idea how many Muslims exist in France, only how many Frenchmen. A third one is the idea that we have on this side of the Atlantic. The French are a nation of cheese-eating surrender monkeys. This was an idea first put forward by Jonah Goldberg in the Conservative National Review and later appeared on The Simpsons of all places. But the idea that the French are very soft on crime, they're unwilling to help us in our own exploits abroad, and they have no real interest in disturbing the status quo. In fact, we accuse them of a certain kind of soft multiculturalism, which in fact the French accuse us of in turn. And so it's interesting that when a very conservative Islamologist like Daniel Pipes, for example, who is not one to side with France on any particular issue, he makes the point that France, in fact, is the most stalwart nation in the West, even more so than America, when it comes to combating extremism, and in particular Muslim extremism abroad. And so the stage is set for a very interesting discussion of how we have to consider France in its own particular war on terror, if we want to call it that, and the fact that in France the security legislation that exists today is in fact far more sweeping and far more repressive than anything found in either the Patriot Act of 2001 or the British Terrorism Bill of 2005. In fact, when the Patriot Act first appeared, the official French institutional response was, well, that's a nice start, but where are you going to go with this? And so even magazines like The Economist, for example, have described the French security regime as strikingly harsh, and we've seen almost 10 in the last decade. The latest one just passed in the month of January. And so what I want to do is just sketch very briefly a short history of religious persecution in France, non-denominational, very ecumenical repression, and Islamic terror in the modern age, at least as it's perceived by the French authorities. For example, the wars of religion, which date back to the 16th century, are an interesting place to start because the idea that faith equals violence, that the expression of one's faith necessarily leads to subversion and violence, is very much ingrained in the psyche. This was a point Charles de Gaulle made continuously on the subject of minority expressions, whether they be languages or different sorts of regional independence issues. And in fact, we see a thread that binds all of the important documents of the last 200 years. For example, the new French Republic, in the Constituent Assembly from 1789 to 1791, they made the point of saying, for example, in the new republic, no one must be bothered for his or her expression of religion, as long as, and this is the kicker, the manifestation of that faith does not trouble public order. And it's this public order discussion, that's the thread that runs through every single major piece of legislation that touches on religion in France throughout the foundation, or from the foundation of the Republic to the present day. The Concordat of 1801, signed between Napoleon and the Pope, which allowed for the first time in several years the Catholic faith to come back and practice freely in France after its expulsion, said that yes, the culte, the worship service of the Catholic faith will be public and conforming again to those statutes and règlement de police-type actions that the government will judge necessary for the maintenance of public order. In 1905, the great church-state separation that marks France today, the first article, for example, says that freedom of expression of faith is, of course, part of the landscape now, with the only restrictions being edicted in the interest of public order. In the Article 25 of the same document, for example, it says that all institutions, all religious homes of worship will be, again, placed under public surveillance, and this in the interest of public order. And finally, the law of 10 January 1936, which has been used several times in the recent past to criminalize and break up either political or religious groups deemed a threat to public order, the same point is made as well. And so in the French legal arsenal there exists a panoply of measures that are there expressly to make sure that these different sorts of expressions of faith, worship, politics, what have you, exist within the confines set by the state, because it's always the state, again, that has the deciding role in things of this nature. So the French, for example, are also quick to mention that their 9/11 happened almost over 20 years ago. 1985 and 1986, a wave of attacks swept through the Parisian metro system. Again, in 1995, there were another series of coordinated, calculated attacks, each of them with a particular Islamist flavor. And again, this creates very big problems in integrating the Muslim minority, which, as Professor Taranto mentioned, is usually a very recent origin, into the national fold. And of course, there have been countless foiled attempts, the state will say, since that time. And so I'd like to move on to approaches, French approaches to faith-based terror. Again, not singling out any particular group necessarily. But there has always been, in fact, as I've tried to show by these documents and these laws, a centralized and overtly repressive approach to public disturbance. Back in the 80s, for example, there was the old line that France is, in fact, a Soviet Union that worked. And the example of LDS temples, in fact, is interesting. Just in yesterday's newscast on France 2, there is the news that the LDS Church just purchased a very large parcel of land just outside Versailles, which they believe will be used to form a temple. This is difficult, though, because in the French legal context, there would be no privacy, so to speak, for worship services inside that building, as the police would always already have the possibility of intervening at the slightest perceived disturbance. And again, as is mentioned in the law, again, all worship services must be part of public record. And so it's difficult to consider the fact that we would have a temple in Paris and put that again in context of Kiev, which was only freed from the Soviet yoke in 1991, which again has one of their own. And so the triage approach the French state has taken to removing the more noxious elements as it perceives them from different kinds of religious expression, be they Protestant, even Catholic, Muslim, and even Jewish, is a sort of triage approach, culling the black sheep from the herd. And this, of course, goes back to the rigid, even repressive intolerance of hate speech mentioned by publications like The Economist, and even the creation of a Muslim council overseen by the state, which is really, in a sense, an effort to so-called drown the beards in a tide of state-sponsored Republican French orthodoxy. And so to do this, we have a couple of figures. One is the actually very well-known figure of Nicolas Sarkozy. once and again the Interior Minister. And it's interesting that in the particular mission of the Interior Minister, he's sort of the go-to guy of this particular French state approach to religion and religious disturbances. He's at once the Minister of the Interior, also of Interior Security, which makes him the top cop of France, and finally of Liberté Locale, which is to say he's the one charged to oversee religious expression in France. And having these two jobs put together in the same portfolio obviously creates some interesting problems for those who would be interested in unfettered expression. And just one more. The idea, again, that everything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The surveillance, the repressive approach, again, that characterizes France and makes it a very different entity from its close allies in the rest of Europe. So, Sarkozy for himself, he made the point that whether I like it or not, Islam is the second religion of France, which is to say that we must integrate it by making it more French. This is the official approach. This leads us to repression of faith-based terror. The first law that expressly designated terrorism was the law of 9 September 1986, the first to actually lay out a process by which terrorist acts may be prosecuted. This was penned in the light and the heat of the subway bombings of that same year. And to put this into action, the French have also beefed up and instituted a number of novel security services. The French have an overseas service, the DGSE. They also have two domestic security agencies. One, the DST, which functions a bit like our FBI, and also another one, the RG, which is something of a political police, something we haven't seen since Eastern Europe. The RG, then, as political police, is charged expressly in our own day with mosque surveillance. And a few of the things that they're responsible, for which they're responsible, for example, is above all the disruption of the recruitment among Islamist groups in France, and above all to guarantee the surveillance of mosques and Muslim social centers. For example, here infiltration is the key word, where the most common being audio recording devices, bugs. This is reported in Le Monde, for example. Everyone knows this. Paid and turncoat informers and any number of plainclothes policemen. In addition, a large number of Arabic speakers are staffed by the security services, charged to translate and provide in summary form the content of the Friday sermon pronounced in every mosque in France, which same report finds itself on the desk of the Interior Minister at 6 o'clock every Friday evening. This is surveillance. Next was the creation after 1986 of the so-called anti-terrorist super magistrate, who was charged to coordinate and execute the offensive against, again, all offending sorts of religious expression. This is what's called the preventative judiciary neutralization, in French speak, of terrorist networks. And an example of what he or she is charged to do is this. Among the panoply of dispositions available to the magistrate and the judiciary police are preventative detentions, which may last up to 3 years, preemptive roundups of many dozens at a time often, the right to detain terror suspects for, quote, association with wrongdoers involved in a terrorist enterprise, the right to issue and carry out search warrants at night, the right to detain suspects for 96 hours without charge, and the right to postpone attorney counsel until after the 72nd hour, and finally the right to request a non-jury trial for the defendant. All these things are used with quite growing frequency. The example of convicted Islamist Rashid Ramda is indicative as well. This was one who was thought to be complicit in the 1995 spray of bombings. He was held by Great Britain, but Great Britain took 10 years to extradite him to France because, they said, he risked, quote, inhumane or degrading treatment in France. He was finally released a couple of months ago into French detention. Finally is the routine work of what's called kicking the anthill. And this is sort of where I draw the title of my talk. This again is carried out by groups like the RG and different kinds of secret police and the security services in France. This example targets Islamists where they live and where they work. This consists of raids for every occasion, health and safety checks on institutions or businesses thought to be associated with radical elements, fire code and safety inspections, tax audits, etc. Anything, again, to trouble the existing order of recruitment. The Economist has dubbed this routine offensive harassment. And the targets include, for example, restaurants, halal grocers, Islamic bookshops, and even communitarian-oriented teen fashion outlets. And all this that claims Le Figaro, that we might terrorize the terrorists without demonizing French Islam or without disrupting the DST's operations and course. And so to summarize again, I would like to say that Islam is not special in the sense that it is the only one to enjoy this special treatment. Every particular group has had its own variety of this treatment, this kicking of the anthill. And in fact, different sorts of Protestant expressions and groups are being targeted today with the same kind of intensity, for example. Jehovah's Witnesses and Scientologists are only a few of them. And again, the idea that there is a good and a bad Islam according to the French state. And the idea then is to remove all the noxious elements and allow what's ever left over to organize itself in its own way in a manner acceptable to the French state and the Republican ideals of the Constitution. And that I would like to leave with you. Thank you very much.
So just have a few minutes for questions. I'll ask both of our presenters to take the podium, and if you direct your question to one or both so that it should be obvious from your question, and also wait for the mic to get to you. Okay, just speak loud.
It's all technical.
Go ahead and ask your question.
My question is for Dr. Matthews. Actually, I was wondering, although all religions in France have been given the same treatment as Islam, do you feel that the treatment of Muslims and the treatment of Islam in France has a special relationship due to the past colonial heritage and maybe some prejudice that comes from that?
Thank you. I would say yes. The way in which the French state has oriented its security services, for example, and the kinds of legislation that have been put forward to address this are special and unique. The idea of the colonial past comes up quite a bit, and I think as well the fact that it's so much that the kinds of threats they're facing today are so much more prominent than the ones we've seen in the past, for example, also make a big difference. But again, the idea is that I believe that many in France feel that they're losing hold of this kind of perceived Republican identity, the one all for one for all, and that really the only way to kind of come back to this notion of a francité, of a certain French state notion, is that we have to be extra vigilant in persecuting and prosecuting those particular movements that would contest this. And so I think there's a certain urgency there that was not, for example, around in the past in many other types of episodes.
My question is for Professor Toronto. From my experience living in southern Italy, it seemed to me that the Italians perceived the threat of immigration slightly out of proportion for a couple of reasons, and one of them because of their negative birth rate. So, and the immigrants tend to have more children than they did, and also the economic effect that a lot of the northern African immigration seems to have. Do you think that that's a factor, because many of these immigrants are also Islam, that perhaps social view affects their view of Islam?
The Muslims themselves often say that they realize that, especially in southern Italy where the economy is so depressed, that there's more of a feeling of threat. But the vast majority of Muslim immigrants don't live in southern Italy for that reason. They live in central and northern Italy. So it's not a surprise to me that southern Italians have maybe certain stronger feelings about the economic dimension of this. Muslims in the north will point out that even though there are some feelings about their presence there, that they're badly needed, and Italian economists will say the same thing. It's almost like the Hispanic community here in Utah. Some people are alarmed by the immigration, but at the same time, they're filling an important role in our economy. So they're needed in Italy. The second part of your question, I'm not sure I understood what you meant by
because of the view of immigration by itself and just of the people, I had the feeling that it was kind of transferred over to the dominant religion of these immigrants, which was Islam.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. As I said, there is a real phobia about any other religion other than Catholicism. Italy has been a very homogeneous society for a long, long time, and so the phenomenon of religious minorities, especially religious minorities that are have significant numbers and clout and presence, is a fairly recent one. And it's only been in the last 20 years or so that Italians have had to really start asking questions about how do we accommodate these differences in our society as it becomes increasingly pluralistic. They haven't been faced with those hard questions to this degree in the past.
Okay, Professor Sprague.
I just have a quick follow-up question to Professor Toronto. You focused mainly on religious identity, but it seems like racism might be a limit to the argument. How would that play into your analysis?
Well, I think racism is definitely there. I mean, Muslims are of many different races, and of course there are a lot of races in Italy that aren't Muslims as well. And I mean, I don't know. I think that's a problem in all of Europe. I know that the European Union has very aggressively pursued programs to try to combat racism. When you walk around the train stations of Italy, oftentimes you'll see information available to report incidents of racism and bigotry. I mean, I think people are trying. There are laws on the books, and people are trying to do something about it. But it's still a fairly new phenomenon that people are struggling to figure out how to deal with. So I mean, you're right. It's not just a religious thing. It's ethnic. It's racial. It's all of the above.
It seems like one way to look at it would be, I know there are a lot of Albanian immigrants in Italy, and they tend to be Muslims. So do they get treated differently from, say, North Africans? Or
that I don't know. I mean, I didn't look at the racial dimension, as you say, as much. Because the black Africans can be Muslim or Christian or some other kind of a religion. The Albanians, I would say, probably are treated a little bit better, but you have to remember that these numbers are taken based on where a person comes from. They may not even be a practicing Muslims. I would say the Albanians are among what I would call the assimilationists. I mean, they generally don't stand out very much because they're fair complected. They tend to be able to speak Italian better, and they tend not to practice their Islam. I mean, they don't stand out as a religious entity.
That was kind of my point. It seems like that would mean that the resistance to Islam, the Islamophobia, has a strong racial dimension to it if the Albanians or Muslims are able to assimilate it.
Except that I think a lot of Albanians aren't seen as Muslims, so their Islamicness is not part of the issue as much in Italy.
This is a question for Professor Matthews. The French and the Muslims are very firm in their stance, and I was wondering, in the future, who do you think is going to give leeway? Is it the French government, or is the Muslim religion going to integrate within France?
I think we're going to see quite a bit of change on both sides. For example, when two journalists were kidnapped in Baghdad last year, the National Muslim Consistory came together with United Voice, all the different currents, for example, which spread from the very secular to, again, the Muslim Brotherhood. They came together and said, we must have the liberation of these men. These are French citizens. We are bound by a bond of citizenship with them, for example, or with a bond of geography. And I think that, again, what the French project is to eliminate those elements that would be contrary to the Republican ideals that they hold dear, to which they hold dear, and to allow what remains to come together. But I do see a bit of change on the part of the French government as well when it realizes that there is not as much to be gained by a strictly security and repressive approach. and again, the sorts of dialogues and things, and the actual creation of the Muslim Council were a way to bring everyone into the same fold for a different kind of either not just observation and in sort of internal policing, but again to hear and understand what the dimensions of Islam in France are, because it is a very, very diverse community, and there's no real one way to characterize it. So actually, I have a midterm to give, so I have to go. But thank you, everyone. Sorry about that.